unique portrait of Tibet and a way of life that's now vanished forever, seen through the eyes of plant collectors Major George Sherrif and Frank Ludlow, A Dream of Poppies.
Riding into Lhasa in a procession unchanged since the Middle Ages, the newly discovered God-King of Tibet is acclaimed by his people and his lords, the 14th incarnation of the Dalai Lama. It is Tibetan Buddhism in full flower, caught just in time. It was filmed for the first time almost 40 years ago by two remarkable British explorers, Frank Ludlow and George Sherrif. For nearly 2 decades, between 1932 and 1949, they were allowed free access to the forbidden and mysterious world of Tibet, traversing the great peaks and plateaux which lie thousands of feet up in the highest mountains of the world, the Himalayas. Primarily they were plant collectors, the last of the great gentlemen amateurs. But they brought back even more than plants, a remarkable film record of their travels in 16mm color, which has never been shown on television before.
Sherrif and Ludlow themselves wouldn't really have approved of this program of ours. They were essentially very private men, self-effacing almost, who sought no public acclaim. Indeed, Ludlow actually turned down the highest honor of the Royal Horticultural Society, its Victoria Medal. But the explorers are known and revered by the cognoscenti in places like this, the Royal Botanic Garden here in Edinburgh, where paintings of some of their finest plants line the exhibition hall. Here, botanists and horticulturalists cherish and nourish the specimens collected in one of the last great natural unspoiled havens of the world, a kind of Shangri-La for naturalists, up to 20,000 feet up amongst the peaks of the Himalayas. Even today, some 40 years later, botanists are still studying that great harvest that Sherrif and Ludlow gathered in Tibet.
Among all the plants they collected, 25,000 in 20 years, one flower stands out for its almost supernatural origins, a poppy that came to Mrs. Sherrif in a dream.
This is the dream poppy.
Sir George Taylor, the eminent botanist and horticulturalist, knew the explorers well.
On the 24th of May 1949, Betty Sherrif had a dream. And she recollects vividly her husband Geordie coming into her tent, standing by her bedside and giving her collecting instructions for the next day. He said, "Betty, you must look for the track below the camp here, which leads to the Mae La. You follow that track for about 3 miles where it bifurcates, and then you take the right-hand branch, go along there for a little way, and you'll see a big rock. And behind that rock, you'll see a poppy which you've never seen before." Sherrif left his instruction at that stage, went out of the tent, but came back and said, "Remember, Betty, you must go." And this is the result. This is Betty Sherrif's dream poppy.
Mrs. Betty Sherrif was a daughter of the famous Church of Scotland missionary family, the Grahams of Kalimpong. She accompanied her husband on all his expeditions after their marriage in 1942. Major George Sherrif was, in effect, one of the last of the British Raj, a son of a wealthy Scotch whisky family from Islay who'd served in the Indian Army and the consular service. In 1932, he teamed up with a man who became his lifelong friend and partner, Frank Ludlow, botanist and ornithologist, the inspector of schools for North India, who'd been the first European to run a school for Tibetans at Gyantse in 1929. It was Ludlow's experience in Gyantse that unlocked the vastness of the mountain kingdom. Sherrif and Ludlow were given a passport to explore the very roof of the world. The two plant collectors made a somewhat improbable partnership, yet it worked wonderfully well. Both were men of the old school. In all their years together, they never reached Christian name terms. They called each other always Sherrif and Ludlow. Sherrif was a man with a camera who took these superb shots. Ludlow was a trained naturalist who'd specialized in ornithology. One of his discoveries was a hitherto unknown Tibetan species. What they had in common was a deep love of plants and a shared determination to introduce as many as possible into the gardens of Britain. They made 7 expeditions in all, sometimes on foot, sometimes riding on ponies, sometimes even on the backs of the Tibetan yak.
A most wonderful beast is the yak, the most marvellous creature I know. You may ride for a week on his back and feed him on pebbles and snow. And when it is freezing outside and the mercury cannot be found, you bury yourself in his hide and measure your length on the ground.
The land they were exploring was and is the most enigmatic in the world. North of India, west of China, south of Russia. A bastion where Tibetan Buddhism had flourished virtually unchanged for 1,000 years. In area, it's as large as France, Germany and Italy put together. Yet it remains a land apart, isolated by choice and religion, and by the huge bulwarks of the sternest mountains in the world, the Himalayas. The Tibetan people believe that it's among the eternal mountain snows that the old primeval nature gods, the gods of bone, both live and have their purpose. The Buddhism which replaced it 1,000 years ago has also walked hand in hand with nature. All life is revered. In parts of southeast Tibet, entire districts are regarded as so holy that no plough or spade is allowed to break the surface. In every sense, it's a medieval society frozen in time. Nothing has changed. Only 50 years ago, the wheel was quite unknown, except for the small hand prayer wheels used by monks and pilgrims. Out in the vast landscape, the population of just over 1 million Tibetans knew almost nothing of the world outside. 2 world wars passed them by. There were no roads, only tracks, and even these were always blocked in winter. Yet it was in winter that Sherrif and Ludlow would set off on their expeditions, struggling over the mountain passes, in order to be down in the valleys by the time the flowers started bursting through in the first flourish of spring. Every valley had its river to cross, swollen with the spring thaw, and each with its own highly precarious kind of bridge to overcome the obstacle. Everywhere they went, there were new plants and flowers, hiding in crevices, clinging to the sides of waterfalls, struggling through the rocky screen. Ludlow once remarked that they were simply standing up asking to be collected and named. The biggest rivers had to be crossed by boat, remarkable vessels like coracles covered with yak skin. A wonderful beast is a yak indeed, as Ludlow had written in the doggerel verses he loved to compose along the way. And all the time, Sherrif was busy filming. It's as if David Livingstone had carried a camera in his rucksack. They began as amateurs, simply with an eye for the beautiful. But with each expedition, they became more systematic, recording the plants in the spring and marking the site so as to be able to return in the autumn to harvest the seeds. Sherrif was the expedition financier and provisioner. He always carried ample supplies of the family whiskey. But it was still very hard work. Every evening there were specimens to be pressed, dried, and recorded. Seeds and living plants were carefully packed in boxes, ready to be carried back across the mountain trails on the long haul back to India, so that the rest of the world could share the botanical riches they were collecting. Eventually, they'd be shipped home in P&O liners, stored next to the refrigerators to keep them alive. It was through these labors that the initials L and S would become so respected in modern horticulture. They excelled in three particular kinds of flowers: rhododendrons, Meconopsis or poppies, and above all, some of the finest primulas that the world has ever seen.
One in particular is that beautiful primula Calliantha, which, as its name suggests, Calliantha means beautiful flower, and it's one of the most wonderful primroses that I've ever seen. A breathtaking sight to see whole acres of hillside covered with that lovely plant, but alas, not in cultivation, but I hope eventually will be.
Sir George Taylor is a former keeper of botany at the Natural History Museum in London and director of the Royal Gardens at Kew. In 1938, he was invited to join Sherrif and Ludlow on their fourth and most ambitious expedition. Their target was the great valley and gorge of Tibet's mightiest river, the Tsangpo. It was to be a 10-month journey across some of the most difficult terrain in the world.
You had to endure rather severe conditions at times. I mean, when we were collecting up in the high mountains, it was continuously raining. That's the condition, one of the conditions which the plants like, of course. And of course, when the monsoon was over and we had to go and collect seeds, the temperatures were very, very low indeed, particularly when we were coming over the plateau on our way back to India. We were often iced up, icicles hanging from our noses, and our eyes seemed to freeze up, and you couldn't keep a glass of water by your bedside very long without it froze solidly. And we had our meals in plates which had an envelope of boiling water so that we could eat our very good food before the gravy congealed. One came out of one's tent in the morning, was drenched, but one went on with the day's work, came back, dried oneself in front of a great big log fire, front, turned the back, steamed away, and then get on with the job of labeling and naming the plants. But there was no cold germs there, no common cold in Tibet, so you had no after effects at all. In fact, you felt on top of the world.
The The result was a positive avalanche of material for science and for the Natural History Museum in London. Almost 4,000 plants were gathered and sent back here for study and, if possible, cultivation. And for the first time, living plants were dispatched back from India by air. Even the modest Ludlow described it as the largest and most comprehensive collection of plants to come out of Tibet in any one season. And to this day, that great collection is still being assessed. "40 years on, we asked the museum authorities to gather together the richest of the material that Sir George Taylor had helped Sherrif and Ludlow to collect and catalogue on that memorable expedition to the Tsang Po just before the Second World War. Then we brought Sir George himself back to the Natural History Museum to relive his experiences for us.
Now, Sir George, I've been looting the shelves of the herbarium for some of these pressed plants, and I'm told that these are some of the really important plants that Ludlow and Sherrif found. Can you sort of go through them and tell me about them?
I'll attempt to do so. Well, this, of course, takes me back a long way. I described this plant, named it after Sherrif. It's a poppy, Meconopsis sherriffii, I called it, and he collected it, first of all, in 36, but it was recollected in 1938, and it grows away up between 15 and 16,000 feet in only one pass between Tibet and Bhutan. This is the type specimen. When botanists describe plants and name them, they must authenticate the name by attaching it to a type specimen so that botanists from throughout the world may come here and see what Meconopsis sherriffii is, and that is Meconopsis sherriffii. Now, unfortunately, this plant is one of the difficult plants to establish in this country, and it's just barely in cultivation in one garden in Scotland.
Let's look at some more, shall we?
Yep. Yes, this is a marvelous plant, and this is very firmly established in gardens in this country. It's a variety of a peony, and I vividly recollect this plant. I collected on the day when we were listening to the radio, and it was the day that Mr. Chamberlain came off the plane saying that everything was all right. You know.
Waving the piece of paper?
Yes, that's the thing. Well, I rather remember this than that. This is a marvellous plant. It goes up to about 8 feet in height. On dry gravel terraces, one would say a very uncongenial habitat for a peony, but there it is. It grew there magnificently. Lovely, silky, yellow petals with the sun shining through. A memorable sight, that plant. Now, what have we got here? This is Betty Sherrif's lily. As you see from the herbarium specimen magnet, it's rather... Do you know the fritillary in this country, the wild fritillary?
I don't know one end of a flower from another, Sir George.
Well, now's your time to learn. That's the flower, that's the bulb, one end to the other.
Yes, I see.
This is one named after Mrs. Sherrif, a lily. She got one specimen only, and it's rather a lovely plant. The petals are maroon in colour and checkered with gold. Very lovely combination.
It's very handsome, isn't it?
Very nice indeed.
Right, what do we have here? A rhododendron.
This is an absolute gem too, may I say. I'm afraid I'll have to repeat myself because I'll run out of superlatives in describing some of these Tibetan plants. This was named after Ludlow, and it's a dwarf rhododendron, Rhododendron Ludlowi, with primrose yellow flowers. It's a marvellous plant. Carpets the whole hillside for mile upon mile, and it's got yellow flowers. Recently, it's been much used in hybridization in Scotland.
Oh, yeah, that's some, yes.
There's the actual specimen, you see, with our field notes. This is a plant I actually got. I used to write field notes in an old notebook, and then when we get back to the British Museum here, these notes were typed out, as you see, on that specimen. That's lovely. It's very lovely plant.
Ludlow.
Aye. This is another rhododendron. I fear not in cultivation, but a very lovely one. Now, the great expert on rhododendrons then was Dr. Cowan at Edinburgh, and he had run out of specific names, or more correctly we call them in botany epithets, because there already was a rhododendron Ludlow, there was already a rhododendron Sherrifii, and many, many moons ago somebody named a rhododendron Taylori, not after me, but one of my clan. So Dr. Cowan thought, well, why not commemorate the three collectors? So he named it Trilectorum, which is the derivative plural for the three collectors. So that's, I claim a third of that.
So the three collectors. I've got another pile for you here, and this, I'm told, is a number of plants which were collected by Ludlow and Sherriff and are now in cultivation in gardens in Britain.
Yes, I fear some of them rather precariously, including this one. This is a marvellous plant. It's a herbaceous daphne, and it grows way up. This is 12,000 feet, but I've actually collected it at 16,000 feet. It's got herbaceous stems with a beautiful head of white flowers tinged with pink, and it's aromatic. It's a very lovely plant indeed.
And it's called?
It's called Stellara camejasmi. You can see its woody rootstock here. This plant grew in my garden within 30 miles of where you're standing now. It was collected in the 1938 expedition, and when I went to Kew, I took those plants with me, but it didn't like Kew as well. It used to like Rickmansworth. I can tell you an interesting about this. Ludlow, when he retired, he came to live near where I was at Rickmansworth, and we were very anxious to get seeds of this plant. Indeed, the plants which are now in existence in the Royal Botanic Edinburgh stemmed from a rather nice exercise of Ludlow. He used to come down to my garden on Sunday mornings, and he says, Taylor, we'll try and get some seeds of this. I said, well, how are you going to get about it? He says, have you got a peacock's feather? I said, yes. So he took a pinule off the peacock's feather, and he pushed it into the throat of the corollars, and the plant set seed. And it's from these seeds that some plants, as I say, growing still in Edinburgh.
What do we have here?
Primula tsariensis. That's called after the district of Tsari in Tibet. It's a very holy district, and so holy indeed that the inhabitants weren't allowed to break the soil and cultivate specimens, vegetables or anything like that. They used to depend entirely on pilgrim traffic. There were several pilgrimages around one particular mountain, which if they performed, they acquired great merit. And this plant comes from that district of Surrey, and it's a very lovely plant again, and is in cultivation in a garden in Perthshire.
All these plants now desiccated and on museum shelves, what do they mean to you now? Do they mean anything living?
Well, I can visualize them all alive, of course, because I collected a good many of them. But what they do trigger off in me is the notion that there's no place in the world which is richer in lovely plants in southeast Tibet. And I'd greatly like to be able to go back, fill the lacunae which I know are there, because it's true to say that every valley we went up in Tibet had specific plants which only occurred there, not elsewhere. They're rather limited in distribution, but it's the tremendous plethora of admirable, lovely plants which we hope could still come into gardens that really would inspire me to go back again if it wasn't too late.
Time was already starting to run out for Tibet in the 1940s. For Sherrif and Ludlow, it meant a new phase in their discovery of Tibet. Instead of going there on expeditions, they now lived there. For nearly 4 years, between 1942 and 1946, they took turns at being the British resident in the forbidden city of Lhasa, the physical and spiritual capital of Tibet. And it was in Lhasa that George Sherriff's camera made this unique record of the 1,000-year-old culture of Tibet, only a few years before it was swept away after the Chinese invasion of 1949. To provide a commentary on George Sherriff's remarkable films, we brought together at St. John's College in Oxford 3 people with knowledge and experience of Tibetan culture and religion: Atto Rinpoche an incarnate Lama who fled from Tibet in the late 1950s, Dr. Michael Aris, Research Fellow in Tibetan Studies at St. John's and former tutor to the royal family of neighboring Bhutan.
Nothing of what you've seen exists now.
And Hugh Richardson, the last British resident in Lhasa.
Now, this is a great procession for the first visit of the Dalai Lama to the cathedral of Lhasa, the Chokhang. He must have been about 8 years old then. He was going, I think, to take religious vows. And it's a much larger procession than happens on any other occasion. And there's a high monk official in a fur hat with a gold top. And these are lay officials wearing some very old ornaments, great turquoise earrings you can see in a charm box covered in turquoise, and beads of coral and amber, which are kept very carefully in the treasury all through the year and handed out only for a procession like this. Monk officials wearing the kind of hat they only wear on this state occasion. Now, lay officials in entirely different sort of dress, gold brocade and fur collars and fur-lined hats with a red crown. And in the background, you can just see the Dalai Lama's his sedan chair coming along.
Inside the palanquin, the Dalai Lama was still a child. He was revered as the spiritual and temporal ruler of Tibet, the 14th incarnation of a line of Gelugpa Lamas and the embodiment of the Tibetan deity Chenrezig. Wherever he goes, hidden in his palanquin, he's protected by his green uniform guard and escorted by his court. His home is Lhasa, the spiritual capital for every Tibetan, situated on a great plateau 12,000 feet up behind the Himalayas, and dominated by the gilded majesty of his winter palace, the Potala. It's in the shrines of solid gold on its roof that the remains of previous Dalai Lamas are entombed. In the spring of 1943, George Sherrif and his camera were there to capture the scenes as a Dalai Lama returned in state to the Potala from his summer palace.
In a royal progress, this is the nearest that the public at large will come to the Dalai Lama in public. Again, we see all the civil and ecclesiastical officers of government in a graded order, proceeding with musicians. In the background, an offering of juniper smoke to the local deities, a very ancient, originally pre-Buddhist tradition, and the great massive pile of the Potala in the background where the Dalai Lama has his official residence. It's spring with the willows coming out, and here comes the Tibetan National Army carrying the national flag, preceded by a band trained by British band leaders. Lee Enfield rifles, some of which would have been used against the Chinese in 1959 during the greatest popular insurrection Tibet ever witnessed. In fact, the only popular insurrection in its long history. These are pilgrims on the so-called Holy Walk, which circumscribes the whole of the Lhasa city and the Holy of Holies in its center, the Chokhang Cathedral. It's an act of great merit, which they store up, not only for their own sake, but for the sake of all humanity. Here we see them prostrating themselves full length on the ground as they make their progress round. On the side of the walk are seen some of these rock carvings, which are being freshly repainted here, probably an annual occurrence. and images of the 1,000 Buddhas with those of 3 times of past, present, and future in the center there. A very typical Tibetan scene, such as you would find all over the country.
The reason for the great number of them at this point is it's one of the turning points on the walk. It's just near our mission at Dekilinka. From there you turn north again on the walk.
It was at Dekilinka, which means the Happy Garden, that Frank Ludlow and George and Betty Sherrif lived for their 4 years in Lhasa. And it was there they played host to the high society of Tibet.
Yes, this is the Dalai Lama's father and mother in the Dekilinka garden, and one of his brothers and little sister. They used to come and attend parties and seemed to enjoy themselves very much. They played all sorts of games. And for us, and I think for a lot of Tibetans, it was a very happy garden. Well, the house itself was so small that we couldn't really entertain in it, but the garden was big enough. We had all our parties out of doors in the summer.
Mm-hmm. With a profusion of English flowers.
Yes, that was the work of Ludlow and Sherrif, who started that great garden. Anything seemed to grow very well there. There was plenty of water. Things that had certainly not been seen in Lhasa before. I used to send huge bunches of sweet peas to the Dalai Lama once a week. He was very fond of them.
Outside the walls of the Happy Garden, Lhasa itself was a medieval city where everything began and ended with its world-renouncing religion. Behind the apparent squalor and deep poverty of its ordinary people lay a rich faith in the Buddhist way of life. By the 1940s, 1 child in every 5 was committed to a monastic life. For centuries, Tibet had deliberately cut itself off from the influences of the outside world. Printing was still being done by hand, from wooden blocks lovingly carved, and then inked and rolled by hand, a method imported from China 7 centuries ago and never changed since then.
The really rich in Tibet were the monasteries. They owned probably more property than anyone else.
The monks effectively controlled Tibet. Their 3 great monasteries in the neighborhood of Lhasa were the nation's universities. Each housed several thousand residents, monks of many different professions.
There were too many monks. If you think of 20,000 monks in Lhasa alone, it was monk-ridden. But it was the real Tibet.
When you say it was monk-ridden, although the monks, no doubt, dominated Lhasa and its surroundings, go outside of Lhasa to the country, in the villages, you would find in every village, almost every village had its small monastery. And relations there were on a sort of family basis.
You have to remember that apart from a division of profession among monks, there was a tremendous range of monastic types. There were the scholar monks, the business monks, a few political monks, a great number of very ordinary monks. And it was this tremendous range of type.
And the mystic monk.
And the mystic monk, who stands at the peak of them all in the eyes of the Tibetan society at large.
Once a year, the great silk temple banner depicting the Lord Buddha is raised on the side of the Potala Palace. It is an object of deep veneration, offering deliverance on sight. It heralded the start of the great New Year festival in February and March, when Tibet relived its past and prepared for its future.
this, the Yasos, the commanders-in-chief of feudal regiments, getting on the horses for them to lead their parade. This is part of the ceremonies, and it happens after the great prayer for 21 days of the new year. About 20,000 monks come into Lhasa, and they pray in the great central cathedral. At the end of that, the lay ceremonies take place. The laymen take their share in defending the religion. There's maids of honor for the Yaso, dressed in a profusion of jewelry, turquoise and seed pearls and jade and all the rest of it, diamonds. Some of it probably borrowed from their friends for the great occasion. That balcony on the east end of the Potala is where the Dalai Lama is sitting to watch a very important religious dance that takes place at the end of the Tibetan year, that's to say about February or March. It goes on pretty well the whole day, and its purpose is to clear away all the evil influences of the year so that they can start fresh with the new year. Here are some of the dancers preparing the way. This figure of a very decrepit-looking old man is a rather light relief put into the serious business of the day, I'm told, as a result of a dream of the fifth Dalai Lama. And he saw this old figure having a fight with a tiger, or perhaps just with a tiger skin, because that's how it's represented in the dance. And he's giving it a tremendous beating, and eventually he has won, and he gets wrapped up in the skin. And this is just a fairly light-hearted interlude. In the meantime, the serious dancing is going on all around him, with the magician dancers, you might call them, who are conducting the serious ceremonial.
For me, it's the figure of the so-called Great Fifth Dalai Lama who really looms strongest over all these pictures. It was he, after all, who reconstituted the new year and gave it its present form. And it was he also who, of course, introduced the whole business of the state oracle.
The state oracle, or prophet of Nechung, appears at the climax of the festival, wearing a huge headdress of black and white plumes.
He is regarded as a protector of the religion, probably taken on from an older faith, and he appears on all important state occasions, as he is now in a state of trance. If he weren't possessed by the spirit, he couldn't wear that enormously heavy headdress. What he says is in a language unintelligible to anybody but his secretary and interpreter. And what he says and what is interpreted is usually rather difficult to understand. He is regarded with tremendous awe by everybody, both ordinary people and certainly by the laymen officials who go to consult him. And it is a very impressive performance. I've seen it several times, and one is greatly influenced by some strange presence in his trance.
In 1949, the state oracle of Nechung got it tragically right. He predicted that the days of Shangri-La were numbered, and that Tibet would soon be harshly awakened from its dream of poppies. Within a few short years, the Lhasa of Sherrif and Ludlow, viewed from the garden the Tibetans called the happy place, would be overwhelmed. For Tibet, the Middle Ages were over.
they'd stuck in a very early medieval stage when the monastery life was medieval and the form of government was really medieval, probably the land system as well. Nowadays described and condemned as having been an oppressive feudal regime. Well, if that's what medieval society was like, I don't think it could have been too bad. I have great admiration for the Middle Ages after seeing Tibet.
In the past 20 years, almost 250,000 Tibetans have followed the Dalai Lama out of Tibet to try to find a new life rooted in the old ways of Buddhism. Today, the monks of Tibet are to be found either in India or in tiny communities transplanted to improbable locations, like the shores of Morecambe Bay in Cumbria. Here in 14th century Conishead Priory, the monks of the Dalai Lama's Gelugpa have established a new centre for students from all over the world. George Sherrif died in 1967 and Frank Ludlow in 1972. Before her own death last year, Mrs. Betty Sherrif released their films to the BBC. And Sir George Taylor now opened a treasure chest.
This is a yak dam which belonged to my friend Frank Ludlow, who died in 1972. Ludlow several times boasted to me that all his earthly belongings could be put into one yak dam. And we use these things in our collecting in Tibet. And to my shame, it has never been opened since it came here after his death from the British Museum.
Well, let's have a look, shall we?
We'll have a go.
Nice noise, isn't it?
Now we can open it.
Right.
Oh dear.
Well,
I'll have to have a look, see what's in here.
it's a lot of books.
Oh, Himalayan Journal, probably with his articles by Ludlow, Takpo and Kongbo, where we were together.
Photographs from Tibet that he took in 23 to 26.
Oh, yes. Chumulari.
It's never
The
been seen
wonderful
before.
peak. Yes.
Marvellous colour,
Ludlow
isn't it?
hid his light under a bushel. There's Ludlow as a young man in Karachi, 1909.
Must be a very rare photograph.
This is real treasure trove, is it not? Here's the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama, 1944, February, in Ludlow's handwriting.
So, 1944 he was taken there.
That was when Sherrif was British resident in Lhasa. What have we got
Let's
now?
clear some of this. Tibet and the Chinese People's Republic.
I better keep that one dark. Oh, these are some personal photographs. I don't know about these. And I would have thought, yes, that's his mother, after whom Primula Elizabethae is named. He was devoted to his mother, and he used to write to her regularly.
Sir George Taylor is now retired, but still loves to cultivate the flowers that keep alive his memories of Tibet.
Now, you have a very charming garden here, Sir George. Is there something about the Scottish climate here at Dunbar which is particularly conducive to growing Tibetan plants that you were familiar with?
No, I must say, Magnus, this is perhaps the worst place in Scotland where you can grow Himalayan plants. The Himalayan plants are accustomed to monsoon conditions with a very, very high rainfall and lots of cloud. Here we are near Dunbar with a very high sunshine record and a very low rainfall. And I must say I struggle to grow some of these rhododendrons and Echinopsis, but it's a struggle worthwhile. And I think to some extent I can succeed by giving them proper soil conditions, and I can always turn on a tap to give them an approach to monsoon conditions.
Do you plant them all with your own hands?
Oh no, I have some assistants, but I get a great satisfaction of getting my hands in the soil and, if possible, planting rhododendrons and the plants of Tibet.
I see you planted a rhododendron named after yourself and one named after your wife in the same bed.
Well, that's quite appropriate, is it not? The one which was named after me, I didn't name it after myself, shall I say. It was a plant that we collected in Tibet, which was shown from Kew, and it required what is known as a cultivar name, and the cultivar name George Taylor was given to it by one of the staff at Kew. The one, Beryl Taylor, was one which I collected in Sangpo Gorge on the Doshong La at 16,000 feet, and it was shown at the Chelsea show 3 years ago by Lord Aberconway, and again it had to have a cultivar name. It was called Beryl Taylor, and I grow these two rhododendrons in the same bed because it's the only place that I can grow them conveniently and satisfactorily.
The finest Himalayan garden in Britain today is the estate at Ascreevy in the cool hills of Angus in Scotland. Here, George and Betty Sherrif came to cultivate their own garden when they had to leave the happy place in Lhasa. And here, from the drabness of winter, the flowers of Tibet rise each spring to blossom once again.
The glories of this garden are one of the tributes to both these great men, and it's the nearest approach to a Himalayan garden that I know of anywhere in the United Kingdom. They made an amazing collection over the 7 expeditions that they did, and the British Museum has been greatly enriched by these collections, as of course have gardens throughout the United Kingdom and also in North America. They had a very special key that opened the doors of Tibet. One day they may open again. We might get back there to collect more of these wonderful plants. But the world has changed, and we'll probably never see the likes of Ludlow and Sherrif again.